What I'd like to do, there's actually a lot of topics on there. I don't even know how many weeks we have, but I'm happy to either prioritize topics you want to see covered there or things you think are related to those topics that are not technically on that list. Happy to go around and collect some questions and thoughts and areas that you want to see. So maybe let's shout, yeah, go on.
Why does bad things happen to good people?
Hey, you like that one?
It's a bit of a classic that I haven't really heard about.
Okay, great. Good. Does anybody else got any particular preferences? Are you okay to shut the door? Just any other preferences?
I liked what was on that.
So anything was on that list?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay, anything else? Anyone about particular preferences, particular desires?
Could you be good through action alone, like disregarding belief?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we can't get stuff this week, we'll try and make sure that is on the list of things to be covered. Good, yeah. Anything else? What else is on our excitement lists?
Why does God allow evil?
Why does God allow evil? Okay, that'll relate very strongly to the why do bad things happen. Okay, so yeah, go on.
I just wanted to think about the Jewish concept between mind and body.
Okay.
Conception of,
Okay, fine. Good. Okay. If that's not on the list, make sure we add it onto that list. I didn't make that list over there. Somebody says, I know what it talks about, so let's just throw things on there. No, they're obviously important topics, but if it's not on there, then yeah, we'll try and make sure that it gets covered. Some mind and body stuff as well. That's what, yeah. That was that?
Yeah.
Okay. That also has many dimensions and many areas around it. Okay, so let's start today talking about why do bad things happen to good people, right? And there's a number of different ways to frame that question, but it needs to come with a little bit of a trigger warning. And nowadays we like trigger warnings. So what one should be aware of is whenever we talk about bad things, given that any room full of people like ourselves here, there's going to be a variety of experiences, including people who've had very difficult experiences. So first of all, a lot of stuff can come up. And second of all, no intellectual answer will remove a painful relationship with an experience. Okay, that's just something very worth saying. Because the minute you ask why do bad things happen to good people, if it's one-on-one, your question has to be, have you been through anything? Because inevitably a heavy percentage of people in the room are hoping that'll become some kind of therapeutic way of dealing with or helping to deal with things they've been through. And that, yes, a philosophical framework can give some perspective that can be useful over time, but it cannot take away the pain that people are going through. I just want to say that by way of an introduction because it is important and because so many people go through so much in life. The second thing I want to say is that the premises of the philosophical question, and this will feel almost cold and like, but I just want to make the point clear. The premises of the philosophical question are really as follows. How can it be that under the monotheistic hypothesis or the typical monotheistic hypothesis, we speak about God as being the infinite creator of the universe, all good, all knowing and all powerful, right? If God is not limited in knowledge, means God knows about everything going on. God is all good, doesn't have bad desires or desires for evil, and is all powerful, is capable of doing everything. Those three ought to predict that nothing bad ever happens. If God is all good, God should only want good things to happen. If God is all powerful, God should be able to make it that good things happen wherever God knows about it. If God's all knowing, then there should be no room for bad things. That's the hypothesis. And the reductio ad absurdum of that is, but bad things happen, right? And when you ask, what do people mean by bad things happen? Here's where now a jump takes place. The typical list will include anything from a Holocaust to a child dying to who knows what, right? So the most horrific and painful things. And that is important. That's a real difficult question. It's not, you're not the first generation to ask that question. It's in biblical text. I mean, the Torah itself, Hashem promises bad things are going to happen to the Jewish people. So the question is literally straight in there in the Torah itself. The entire book of Eov, the book of Job, is a whole book of, according to one view in the Talmud and Maimonides, it's not even a literal story, but it's exploring the pain and suffering of somebody who seems to be very good, and so on. But you'll notice the philosophical question is equally as severe as to if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, then how did I hurt my toe this morning? That should surely disprove the existence of God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing. Now, the reason I want to make this an introduction is tapping into the point I was saying earlier. A lot of people, when you say that, give you a frown and think, no, that doesn't disprove God, right? Holocaust disproves God, not banging your toe. But philosophically speaking, it's an identical question. Emotionally speaking, it's not. But philosophically, it's as difficult to explain me hurting my toe. Because if God's all good, God shouldn't want me to have to go through unnecessary pain of hurting my toe. If God's all knowledgeable, he knew it was about to happen. If he's all powerful, he could have stopped it. So why didn't he? So assuming me hurting my toe is a bad thing, then that just disproves the existence of God, who's all good, all powerful, or all knowing. So the reason I'm saying this is not to be callous or frivolous about the amount of pain and suffering people go through. But you'll get your atheist who appears on some show somewhere and goes through some emotionally traumatic thing for us just to hear, and where's God in that thing? But that's the emotional problem we have. But the philosophical question is, how does anything go wrong? How is it that if I put my hand in my pocket to get some change and it's not there, where's God? That is actually the philosophical question, because theoretically the expectation we set up is nothing bad should ever happen. How does anything bad happen? How do I get stuck in a traffic jam? How does somebody lose their job? How does a divorce happen? How does somebody get hit in the face or stolen? All these, but down to the most smallest level, how did my football team lose the game? I mean, you're going to say, because your football team, how can God not make it that all our football teams somehow win? Or sports is just different, or we're all attached to the same team. Or it's not difficult for an infinite creator to make it that nobody's ever sad at losing a football match, right? It's not. So why are we in a world where anything goes wrong at all? That's the point I want to make very clear. Now, hopefully, the philosophical answer to why did I hurt my toe will also, or set of answers will also help us to understand philosophically other stuff too, but we'll notice the difference in our emotional reactions to the two. That's what I'm trying to separate out. There's a philosophical question. How can anything wrong at all exist? Which goes all the way up from the things we just can't cope with to things we're quite comfortable with. Most people in this room are not going to lose sleep at night over the fact that I hurt my toe this morning, but you might lose a lot of sleep overnight or be bothered by other events that are going on. Okay, but the philosophical question remains the same. So that's what I want to kind of start with. Next, let's explore the philosophical question itself. And what you'll see if you study lots of different Jewish sources is lots of different approaches to the question, not just in Jewish sources, but in non-Jewish sources too. Right? We're not the only theological system in the world that believes in a God who's all good, all powerful, all knowing, and is aware that things go on in the world that seem inconsistent with that. So there's lots and lots of stuff people will have heard of already, and lots of ideas that are put out there. But I think one of the most important, I've been thinking a lot about this question over the years, is sometimes you'll hear an answer that explains part of the scenarios. But what about this? What about natural disasters? Or what about this type of thing? What about that type of thing? And what we need to realize is there's more than one question that's typically being asked when people say, why do bad things happen to good people? There's possibly 4 or 5 different questions. I'll give you an example. They sound very similar, but they're not identical. One is, why does death happen? And I'll explain to you soon why that's unique. So most people, when you ask them to talk about what emotionally bothers them with this question, it'll be things that typically, I'd say the vast majority of cases involve death. Why did a child have to die? Why did a Holocaust happen where lots of people die at the same time and are killed in a malicious way, right? Why does, why does tsunami happen? Why does this happen? Why does that happen? A lot of them revolve around death. And there's a specific reason why death has a unique problem too, which I'll come to. The second is a more broad question, why do bad things happen, which I'll define soon. But that question itself is anywhere between why do things happen that I don't think should happen, to why do things happen that I think God wouldn't want to happen. Those are also slightly different questions. To why do painful things happen, right? We'll soon see that even that's a different question. Bad and painful are not necessarily synonymous. They might be. To why do people suffer, which also might not be the same thing. Theoretically, you have something that's not bad, that causes pain, but you don't suffer, you do. So these are similar, and there's an overlap between the questions, but as we tease them out, we might start to see there's differences between them. Okay? Any point, by the way, feel free to ask or comment or whatever you want. British audiences like to be silent for a while, so you can feel free to be a little less British, a little bit more interventionist. Okay, so let's start with the first question, death, and why death is such an important question. Because it implies finality to life. And if God is good and created this world to do good or to offer good on any level, which is a standard view in monotheistic thinking, or at least in things like Judaism and other such faiths, then what's the point of giving a life and then taking it away forever? If somebody would give you a gift and it would be amazing, and then they would take it away from you and take away any memory you'd ever had of it, would there be much point in the gift they'd given you? Not much, right? Because you got something, you're gone, and then you've forgotten you ever had it. That doesn't seem to be very helpful. Now, certainly not if you're the infinite being who's trying to give this perfect act of giving. What's the point of giving life if it's going to end quite soon and then be gone forever and never be remembered by that person whatsoever? Doesn't seem like there's particularly much to say for it, especially if God's outside of time in the first place. It's like, oh, that blip of time, there'll be something aware, boom, and then it's just gone everywhere else. And that question is actually so powerful that there does seem to be a plausible contradiction between the view that there is this all good, all loving, all knowing, all powerful God, and the fact that life has to end at death. And it's such a powerful contradiction that it implies there's only one of two options. Either that there isn't a God that's all good, all knowing, all powerful, all loving, or death is not final. Those are your two options, or two most natural or sensible options. Well, that doesn't mean there isn't such a God. It just means that there isn't if there is such a God, then death is not final, or at least doesn't have to be final. If death is final, then there isn't likely to be such a God. That's really how the two line up. And that's, of course, why pretty much all monotheistic systems will conclude that, for other reasons as well, but that, death is not the end of the story. It's not necessarily the end of the story. It could be the end of the story, but it doesn't have to be the end of the story. People have the opportunity through life to have an eternal connection with infinite creator of the universe. And that breaks down into a whole bigger discussion about life after death, resurrection of the dead, what's the end of history, what's the Garden of Eden, and all these sorts of things. But I just want to make that point because it's a very important, it's not a Schoenvort's point. In some ways, it does seem to be a contradiction between the notion of God who creates the world whose purpose is to give and the finality of death. By the way, according to many rabbinic sources, the first thinker who really spent enormous time working this out was Avraham Avinu, Abraham, who concluded the world must have a creator, who concluded the creator's purpose must have been to give, and then concluded that life cannot be final. This phase of life cannot be final. It's not the phase of the full giving. It's not the phase of the full relationship with God. It certainly doesn't make sense that God would create it and leave it undone. And that's why, philosophically speaking, before you get into anything to do with tradition or anything to do with the Torah or Kabbalah or anything else, you'd have a logical reason, if you think there's a good ground to believe there's an infinite loving creator, to believe that this is not all there is to existence. Okay. But with that or without that, there's still plenty of things in this world that appear to be bad. For example, even if death is not final, it's very painful for the people who go through it, who go through the others, who are on this side of it, let's say. It might be the person who's died in all sorts of wonderful zone, but it's not nice to be the person who's alive in this world while that loss is happening. And apart from death, there's all sorts of other things we alluded to before. There's a lot of horrific things happen in this world that are not death. People who get injured or hurt, right? Terrible things that happen to people, down to small, painful things like my football team lost the game where I hurt my toe. There's a huge range of things that seem to be bad things in the world. And so now, apart from just death, let's broaden the question to bad things. And here, I'm going to make a point that many, many sources make in different ways, and the biblical text itself says this pretty clearly in words like, Lo machshavosei machshavosechem, my thoughts as God are not yours. And let me give an analogy to this. I don't know if any of you have any very young siblings, nieces, nephews. If you don't, that's fine, but you can imagine one, right? Imagine you've got, let's say, a very, very young adult, a 3-year-old kid somewhere. Might be your child one day, might be a niece or nephew or sibling or whatever. And at that very young age, children are not aware of things that are very obvious to us. They range from the fact that vaccines might be good for you, an injection could be good for you, to the fact that cars in the road could be very bad for you. Not always does a very young kid understand that. And that's why it can be quite dangerous if you take them out near the roads and let them, don't hold their hand, they can quite happily run into the roads and it could be quite bad. So you imagine the scene that you, as a birthday present, you gave the kid a third birthday present, a little football, and they are so excited, and the cute moment where they tear it open, they realize what it is, and you're just filming them as they go out to the front garden and they're playing around there. And then you imagine the scene where somebody must have left the gate open, and that ball is now starting to roll down the front pathway towards the road. And as you're filming, you're suddenly get this horror moment of, oh my goodness, I can see what's about to happen. The ball's going to go into the road. It's a busy road in front of our house. The kids are already running after the ball, right? In their mind, emotionally, their relationship to that ball at that moment is roughly equivalent to our relationship to the 10 people we most love in this world, right? It's like they're all about to run away from us. And we've got to do everything we can to get that ball back. They have no clear concept of the danger that these things in the road pose to them. So you can just see the horror story unfold. And in that sort of moment frozen, and then you quickly react and you go running out as fast as you can, and you just catch the kid just on the edge of the pavement before they go into the road, and you're holding them as tight as you can. Now the ball is already in the road, and one car's already knocked it, and it's gone down there, and another car's moved it, and the kid is kicking and screaming and crying, and you're holding them as tight as you can, and all of a sudden a big lorry comes, and that ball is gone. And that child is going absolutely crazy. And what the child would be asking, if you could translate it from childese to adultese, would be, why do bad things happen to good people? Why is my all-loving, all-powerful parent, big brother, big sister, uncle, aunt doing this terrible thing to me? Now, here's the thing. From our perspective, we're actually doing the best thing we could possibly do for this person. From their perspective, we're doing the most horrifically terrible thing possible. And we don't actually have the conceptual apparatus to translate to them what we're doing. We can't explain to them at that moment, the ball's replaceable, I'll get you another one this afternoon or tomorrow. We can't explain to them how dangerous the situation is. If you try and say those things, they won't even understand it. And that's so often the case, that when we say bad thing or good thing, it's not the act, it's its context. And the broader the context, the more information you bring to bear when you're talking about it will radically shift or alter the perspective. You can have that when you're evaluating a war going on. Is it good or bad? Are you using the right things or wrong things? Well, what's the context? What's the big story? What are the alternative options? These are always factors that are going to determine a good or bad act. So something that might seem like the most bad thing from one perspective, from a bigger perspective, might seem good. And the perspective gap turns what you're doing, which is the kindest act you could do for this child, to the most, from their limited perspective, where they just can't understand what you can understand, to the most terrible thing going on. And now think where the gap is likely to be bigger, or is bigger, between child and adult Homo sapien, or between an adult Homo sapien and an infinite creator of the universe. Right? It's a rhetorical question. Right? Obviously, the gap is going to be infinitely larger when you're dealing with and even think about that. Think about if the creation hypothesis is correct, if what we're saying is true, that you've got a creator of the universe who's factoring in billions of human beings across the whole history of the universe, all of space and time, the possibility there's life in this physical world and then life beyond it. Maybe even in a lot of Kabbalistic talk, reincarnation of souls coming in and out of the world and eternity. And you got all these calculations going on. And you make decisions and movements that are aligning all this stuff. And then you zoom in and look at our little perspective where we hang around for a few decades and we know a few hundred people and we're trying to evaluate this big picture. We have very little chance that we can evaluate it correctly. And it's not unreasonable or unlikely that lots of things can be happening to us that say, oh my goodness, this is not how I want things to be. And maybe this is really, really, really how I can't cope with things being. And just zoom out and it looks completely different. So that doesn't mean, and I'll come to in a minute what the wrong way of understanding that is, that doesn't mean that we want to trivialize what people go through when they struggle with things in this world. But the ability to say that it contradicts the infinite being's big plan of how to make everything work for the good and how it's all going to be good and how it will all be good for all of us who make the right choices and so on, that's not contradicted by the fact that our perception of things can be very bad. They're very bad at the moment. Now, that doesn't mean that we should just say, oh, I believe everything Hashem's doing is for the good. Let's use real strong Jewish language right now. Therefore, when someone dies, we should just rejoice, clap our hands and say, don't worry, it's all good. Yeah, be honest.
Following that on, and assumption for that conclusion is pain and misunderstanding.
Excellent follow-up question. We're going to come to that in a second, because what in Jewish law we understand is that there's two different blessings. A blessing when you hear good news. You say, Baruch HaTova, may to bless as God is good and does good. And blessing on bad news. You say, Baruch Dayan HaEmet, right? Blessed is the true judge. or die in MS if it's Ashkenazic. That's the true judge. Now, ask the Gemara, the Talmud, that, but if a person's really holy, and other commentaries really discuss it, if a person's really, really holy, and they are on this level where they know everything's for the good, and they hear sad news, can they just rejoice and say, oh, bless God is good and does good? And the answer is no, it's forbidden. Why? Because it's painful. There's still a distinction between things that are good and we can feel and connect to the good, and things that may be for some bigger picture good, but they hurt, right? And that distinction now raises the next question of, even if God is doing everything for the good, but why does he allow pain? You see, I can't make that child not feel the pain of the moment. I'm doing the best that I can to hold that child back. But if I was more powerful, I would want them to understand what's going on. Or if they can't understand what's going on, I would at least want them not to have to go through the pain of the whole thing. So I get that God will have a calculation different to ours. What we think is good or what he thinks is good is not going to be the same thing. And there might be a lot of that. That's to be expected. But why does it have to be painful? Why do painful things have to happen? That's surely something God could still remove. Do good and let it feel good. Why do we have to go through pain? So that's not the same as why do bad things happen. Bad things is assuming I've got enough perspective to make that judgment. And the problem is we don't have that perspective to make that judgment. But painful things, surely all good or loving creators shouldn't want there to be pain in the world. That's what we might think. And Jewish sources disagree with that. They think we actually should have pain. But before we get there, let's take one more step, an important stepping stone now. I'm just trying to check how much time we have. I don't think we've got a lot of time. So let's see how far we can go here. Is pain ever a good thing? Can you give me an example where pain is not a bad thing?
Like, for example, if you put your hand on something hard, and at some point it will start hurting, so you won't take your hand away.
Yeah.
Not to hurt yourself further.
Yeah.
Like, for example, or like sunburn as well.
Right.
So it's kind of protect you from further harm.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah. What were you going to say?
Just the long term, it makes you stronger. That's the classic.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But I like the example of physical pain. I'll come in a second. Yeah.
The alternative example to something like that would be supposedly pain without any a moment for growth, where you can't see what the positive side could be.
Yeah.
Because there's that story of the baby deer that gets caught in a forest fire, and no one is around to save it. And instead of just dying there and then, it suffers in agony for days and dies unknown to everyone around. And then the question is, well, what was the point in it suffering for so many days? Why couldn't it have just died?
Okay, good. So let's first come on to the physical pain, because that's go on.
Appreciation of the pleasure.
That can also be a case that the striking feature of physical pain is the pain itself is good. It's not just a pain that accompanies good or a pain that allows something else to be good. It's intrinsically good, right? Physical pain is intrinsically good in as much as you're in a bad situation. The best thing you can have is pain. If your hand is on a boiling radiator or on a boiling kettle, the most disastrous thing to have at that moment would be to have no pain. Because at that particular moment, the hands would now be starting to be torn to pieces. A child always assumes the problem is pain. An adult realizes pain is not the problem. Pain is information that there is a problem. Okay? Pain is not the problem itself. So, and a child thinks, I've got a stomachache, I just want medicine, take it away. The adult realizes 1 second, is there a virus? Is there a bacteria? Is there a toxin? Something's going on. Let's deal with that as well, right? So physical pain is not a problem. Physical pain is information that there is a problem. Okay. Does that extend beyond that? So now the real next question becomes, so the mistaken view or the jump here that might be too fast or too tempting but too early a jump is, so anybody who goes to any pain in this world is telling them they're doing something wrong. That's not the Jewish perspective. At least it's certainly not always. It could be that things like that happen, but it's not generally what's going on. But what is going on is this. What, from a Jewish perspective, is the worst thing that ever happened in the world?
Destruction. Leaving God and leaving destruction.
Yeah, there's two good candidates there. What were you going to say?
Oh, I wasn't.
There you go.
I could.
What could you say? What were you going to say? What's that?
The eagle.
The golden calf. Okay, yeah. Go on. What else did you want to say?
Like in modern day, like the Holocaust and things like that. Right. Not
Holocaust. Yeah. Well, that is Judas.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Biblical.
But yes, okay, yeah. So they're all good answers, but of them all, even worse, the Holocaust is beyond horrific, right? And the destruction of the Second Temple and the massacres of Jews of enormous numbers are hugely traumatically horrific. But even worse than that, from the Torah perspective, you might say the floods, but even worse than that is the Garden of Eden. Bless you. If you're following the Torah through, the worst thing that ever happened in the world was the Garden of Eden. And very, very roughly, that story is not just a story of one guy messed up and that's it. Death came into the world as a result, suffering, pain, everything came into the world as a result of that. And if we take just a moment to grasp what that story is on a deeper level. So the word Eden in Hebrew, do people know what it means? I know some of you do because I've been in class, so I've taught this before. But Eden is one of the biblical words, one of the Torah's words for time. The modern Hebrew word Zaman is not in the Torah. It appears in later biblical works. The word Eden is one of the words for time. When Abraham is still standing before God, that temporal word, Adenu, Omed. In fact, it's preserved in modern Hebrew. Words with the root Eden, Adayan, Adenu, these are all time words. It's a garden of time. And that means that on some level, it's not a place necessarily, if you go back in a time machine, although there is some debate about this, but if you can find a particular place or time, it's all of time. It's all of reality from a different dimension that touches you and me and everybody else. And Adam in that garden is like a soul that represents the whole of humanity. Humanity was one, divided into male and female, and its only jobs were to come back together and come to God. And instead, man made the fateful choice to become the center of reality. Says the serpent, you can be like God, you can see the world through your subjective eyes, you can feel how the world is like, and suddenly, instead of there being one humanity, it shatters into billions of fragments. And as we leave Eden and enter the world, as we understand space-time today, you and me and everybody else walking this world is one of those little broken pieces. And the purpose of the world is to rebuild humanity, one relationship at a time. This is why we say love your neighbor as yourself is the great rule of Torah, because ultimately we're one self. That's what we pray for every Rosh Hashanah. If you follow the traditional prayer book, the whole world should become one, to connect to you, God, and do your will. Right? Yes, we first want it as a Jewish people, but the goal is ultimately the whole of mankind there, and that's what we're looking for. And in that world where we could have, as one, we could have this relationship. If you think about this, take cells of a human body compared to the human body. You can have trillions of cells in the world, quadrillions of bacterial cells. They can't between them do a single process, a single equation, or have a shred of consciousness as far as we know. But you put a tiny amount of them together and into a human body working together, you produce properties like consciousness and awareness and being able to understand the universe and relate to its creator. You imagine humanity becoming one, and the level we'll be able to attain, and that level of closeness to the creation of the universe, that's what we're trying to get to. In that world where everything is shattered and broken, and people struggle to even make one relationship work, and the amount of pain and damage that happens in day-to-day life, never mind the amount of suffering and the amount of wars and the amount of everything in this broken, shattered, devastated world, each of us gets to pop into it for a few decades, try and do something good, and leave. Imagine if we popped into this world for a few decades and never felt anything wrong with it, and spent our life trying to accumulate a bit of money, going on some nice holidays, watching the world fall apart and suffer, not feel any pain whatsoever, and left. We turn up on the other side and God says, right, how did it go in there? Oh, it was quite a bit of fun. Did you do anything about this broken, dying world? No, it should die in peace. You just wreck the whole purpose of all of creation. So God says, in that world that's broken and falling apart, you have to feel pain. There's two ways to feel the pain. Either I'll make sure you sense the pain, or at least look around you and see all that pain. But don't just accept the world is good and it's fine and I'll be indifferent to everything else going on over there and I'll just try and get a nice holiday and then die. That's not what we're here to do. And in fact, again, I'm turning to the more Kabbalistic sources, but you don't really need them to get here. There's this imagery of sometimes the most righteous or powerful or capable people will go through tremendous suffering. because they can absorb the pain of the world and do something about it. In other words, it's like God sending his soldiers into the most difficult trenches, right? But those can be the most powerful or beautiful souls who can do something with it. And that leads straight on to the final of the question. So we talked about why does death happen? From a deep Jewish perspective, it doesn't really. What about bad things? There aren't really any in the big picture, but there are painful things. But pain is not the problem. The problem is the shattered, broken, devastated world. And the worst thing to be living life is to not feel any of that. So now comes the final question of suffering. What happens with that pain? And there's different ways of dealing with pain. The first is the instinct is the minute we go through it is to be crushed by it. Pain that we don't choose to have, okay, even hitting the toe for a few moments can be really, really crushing. Bigger pain that's more traumatic or difficult to deal with can be crushing for longer. And some pain could crush a person so deeply that it's possible they don't always get out of it. But in the main, the stage 2 is recovering through it. And that can be a large piece of work or a small piece of work. If you bang your toe, it takes a few minutes. If something more serious happens, it could take a year or two or whatever it is to break free. But there's a level even beyond that. And this is the level the Torah really wants us to be on. It doesn't blame us if we don't get that. But the level we want to get to is we've recovered, we've stabilized, we've worked our way through, maybe we've been through therapy if we need to, whatever it is. But now, because of what we went through, we'll never really be the same person. We take that pain and it becomes an energy point to rectify the world. Most people who did incredible good in the world, probably almost everybody or everyone who did incredible good in the world, either went through their own pain or felt the pain of others. That's what drove them to become great. You see in all the biblical characters, without exception, every single one of them either goes to tremendous pain, like Joseph being thrown in, after doing all the right things, he gets sold into slavery, thrown into prison, and everything he does right, he gets more and more down. To Moshe, who's raised in a palace, but goes out to his brothers and sees their suffering. To Queen Esther, everybody, it's their own pain or the pain of others. And that's true down to the modern era. I remember when I was in university, there was a series of books written by a guy called David Pelzer. Now, afterwards, there's a whole controversy, but basically he read a book called The Boy Called It. And the story was one of the most horrendous abuse, right? Horrendous, like his mother hadn't wanted him, and she called him it, right? Till pretty much the day she died, to her deathbed. And she used to burn cigarette butts out in him and send him to school with never clean clothes, and he got bullied, and every terrible, horrific thing. And every time he's putting his life together again in one foster home, wherever, it just keeps crashing down on him. And somehow he has the resilience to keep surviving and keep getting through all the horrific stuff he's going through. And he decided to write the book. And if I remember correctly, the book was primarily a cathartic process, right? And I think, I think he was in a relationship with somebody who wanted to make money, and then she walked away from it. I don't remember the details of everything there, but I just remember it was a big deal at the time. And the amazing thing, unbeknownst to him, is it became a runaway bestseller. It became a very, very popular book. And then he wrote more books, and then eventually he took some of his money and he began to speak in places, and he'd go and speak in a school or go and speak to legislators and eventually built a whole foundation, right? And then his brother wrote a book, and this one wrote a book, and this one, of course, some journalist says maybe it's not all true, and it is all true, and whatever. Let's work on the assumption that it's all true or mostly true or whatever it is, right? He is somebody we can't explain. We don't have a God's eye vision as to why he went through what he went through. That's a question we can't answer. We don't have the infinite perspective of God. But we do know that what he did as a result of what he went through has probably shaped or changed the lives of thousands and thousands of people. And the knock-on effect of that's beyond imaginable, because everybody who gets damaged as a child, a relatively high percentage of them cause more and more damage in their life, right? So you're talking about knock-on effects of millions and millions and eventually billions and billions of people whose lives will now be better as a result. So again, that doesn't give me an answer to the question why it happened. I'll have to wait till I have a God's perspective or see the afterlife or something. But the Jewish question really is almost a reflective question, since I don't know what it is, but I do know what I got to do with it. I can't try to let myself be a victim. Again, it's not always possible, not till we certainly don't judge others who do struggle. But our job is to take it and turn it to an energy point to change things. Now, how much does God just step back and abandon the world? You know, what about children who die? What about old people who suffer? So there's a lot of more specific direction, animal pain, all these things. So Maimonides actually says when we kick God out of the world, he literally says, okay, watch nature run and see how painful things will happen as a result. When you're ready to have me back in the world, we'll change it around. Others have different views. In the Kabbalistic view, there's the idea of soul migration coming in and out, or God could switch off the pain of, let's say, an animal that looks like it's suffering. There's a lot of things. So, for example, I'll just give a practical example of soul migration and reincarnation. The Chazon Ish, Rabbi Shaya Karelitz, was considered in the 1950s, generally considered the greatest or one of the greatest rabbis alive. And he, you know, he was a very holy man, but he wasn't like, wouldn't say things just for the sake of it. And when severely handicapped or disabled children came into the room, he would always stand up for them. And somebody once asked them why. They're not always capable of even seeing or understanding. And he said, because theologically speaking, why would God put a soul into the world that has very limited ability to do something in this world? And he said, because we have two purposes in the world. The purpose, the choices we make, and the other purpose is the impact we have on those around us. Sometimes that's not even something we choose. So if a soul had achieved very close to perfection, and now there's a dilemma, it's got a bit of imperfection. Does it go through the painful process of the afterlife cleansing to be ready for a relationship with God, or could God send it back into the world? So give it another go. But the problem is it's almost perfect. If it messes up again, it can mess up. So God placed it in a world where it has extremely limited free will. And because of that, it now, all it can do is its impact on other people. And that will bring it back to perfection. And he wasn't saying that just to comfort people. He wasn't saying that to the parents of the child. He was saying that his understanding of the works, I don't know all these Kabbalistic works, of these works, is that's actually the truth. And so that's another whole dimension of things that we don't see. Or the pain that we go through towards the end of life is in place of the damage that one would have to undo in the afterlife, which could be a lot more painful. So there's other pieces to this puzzle. But I just wanted to get to the major aspects of this topic. There are a lot of details still that need a little working through. But in the main, let's sum up what we've said here, because that's, I think, the key point. The first is going back to where we started from, that there's a difference in the emotional question and pain and things that come up whenever we talk about this inevitably, and all the pain that people in this room might have been through, versus the philosophical question. The philosophical question is it possible that a God who's all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing would allow things to happen in the world that include finality? Finality, probably not. Bad things, well, bad and good depends on the perspective. We're not going to understand what God's doing in the world. And these questions are as big, whether it's hitting my toe or things that we're traumatized by. Painful things. Yes, there's pain. And from a Jewish perspective, pain in the big picture is good because the world is in a mess. Again, we don't need to personally go through pain necessarily. God decides who goes through what, who struggles with what, who has what thing to work through. But the principle that in theory, everybody should experience that there's something really wrong with the world because we're in this world. We're not in this world to have a miserable time, but we are in this world to recognize what's wrong with it and to do what we can to rectify it. And that may be very limited, it may be very big, it may be short-term, it may be long-term. But the ultimate question of do we need to just suffer passively or can we be active? In the end is yes, we need to work through a healing process, but in the long run, whether it's the pain that we're going through or whether it's the pain we see in others, we should be people who don't run away from the pain, but take it and use it as a force to make good in the world. So that as history eventually ripples back and humanity is able to reconnect and come back to the Garden of Eden consciousness again, we will look back and be able to say we were a part of that story. We were a part of the healing of the world. When we broke apart, it hurt. But we felt the pain of each other little fragment. And we did our bit to bring the healing back to the world, where everything will come back together as one, back in its relationship with God. And that, I think, is a very important overview, together with other smaller ideas like the issue of some pain in this world being for the good and not having to go to the afterlife, like soul migration, all this other stuff. But it should give us at least a framework with which we can philosophically then think about a lot of this stuff. So I hope that's been something of value and help. I did want to finish. I know we started a few minutes late, so I think this is about the right time to be finished. So I'm going to stop there. If you want to stay behind and ask questions, you can with pleasure. But I don't want to take you longer than is necessary. So I hope that's been helpful. Thank you. Special.
So when someone goes through pain or sees someone else have pain, from that they decide to do something. Are you saying that is part of the process of the world built to what it was originally in the
Exactly.
things went sideways.
Okay. That is exactly it. Well, while it's broken, you have to feel pain. Just like you physically broken a limb, you have to feel pain.
But I guess it's hard for you to reconcile that with when someone decides to do rebuilding when they didn't feel pain in the first place. And also, what if someone feels the pain and doesn't do anything about it?
Okay.
Are they dealing with pain wrong?
So good. Let's deal with the first one first. There's no such thing as someone who wants to rectify something they don't think is a problem.
Sure, but
So they might not feel the person on life pain, but they see there's something wrong with the world. Look, as Jews, we fast 4 times a year, and every single day we try to focus ourselves on what's wrong with the world. We're not trying to be miserable, but we try to remind ourselves the world's a painful place. One day a year, we literally sit on the floor and cry about it. But all the way through, every single day we pray about what's wrong with the world, right? So we're trying to sensitize ourselves, even if we, please God, never go through any pain ourselves, but feel there's something wrong with that world. Right? We're really trying to do that. We want to do that.
so deep down, you're saying even if we don't feel the personal pain, we're seeing something wrong with the world. And in a way, seeing someone else's pain.
Absolutely.
They did not.
It shouldn't be deep down. It should be at the forefront of our
So
consciousness.
let's say we see, I don't know, there's the litter is the nervous flowing in the area. You want to start doing something.
Yes, a person should take responsibility even for small things that are wrong in the world, but we should live lives to bring God back into the world and to end all the pain and suffering. That's what we should do. Our purpose of our life should be thinking bigger than that. Sure. Now, the second type of person who goes through life indifferent, look, we can't judge anybody. God's judging everybody. But as a general rule, if a person does nothing good in their life, it's very unlikely they fulfill their purpose in this world.
But what about in a specific issue that's bad and they feel pain, and from that they just decide to kind of stay with their own kind of thoughts and not interact with other people? In that
Again,
situation,
we can't judge people, but as a general principle, we shouldn't be going through all our life indifferent. And the ultimate indifference is getting the world back to the Garden of Eden. What do we take to do that? That's another whole question. Because there's the short-term problems of the world, but there's the longer-term problems of the world as well.
sure.
Right? So all of that needs to be, we can't solve all that, but we can play our part. Right? We play our part in the immediate pain around us. Some of our neighbors suffering, some going through terrible illness. We can do what we can to help. And then there's the bigger pictures. What can we do to heal the whole world?
So I guess there's not really a way we should act in specific moments. It's more how we should behave generally throughout life.
Correct. But there may be very specific issues that emerge, depending on what we're up to in life, either very short-term issues or longer-term issues. In the end, we believe that Jewish people and keeping Torah is also huge. It's the huge part in all this healing process. So that's also an important part of our lives. But there may be local issues that emerge that need our attention. And so, generally speaking, a person who's willing to take responsibility and takes the world seriously, takes God seriously, and takes care for others seriously is probably going to make the right sort of decisions. A person who doesn't train themselves and just thinks about themselves is probably not going to make the right decisions.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
No, I didn't think I heard a question. Because I was a little bit thinking about would be kind of related to like human nature as people who inclined to be good or bad. And one of the extreme spectrum of being bad. Is that just pure evil?
It's a very good question. What is pure evil? How many we can?
Is that an illness or an actual evil?
Yeah. So the gap between an illness and an actual evil is not so big. Most evil is done because of damage.
Yeah.
Right? Most people who really hurt others are really hurting themselves. That doesn't absolve them of responsibility. But because the person should at the very least have enough sense that this is not why we want to happen. But you see, we can simultaneously hold somebody really guilty for what they did wrong, but also realize that ultimately to get rid of things like that, the world will give you a shield like that. There may be, the Torah speaks about people so irredeemably evil like Amalek. We don't have them nowadays. So there might be people who turn themselves into the evil, the Hitlers as well. Then only thing to do is kill them. But for most people, even if that's what you're going to do in the short term, the longer term has to be trying to address where you can. And the longest term is bringing some light into the world. We also believe on a subconscious level, the world with enough light in it, the darkness will be gone. So there's multiple levels of addressing issues. Yeah, there's a lot to be said about these sorts of things.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
I really enjoyed it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so nice to see you.
Have you ever read Candide by Voltaire? It's just something about a French philosophy book. It's like a Sartre book. And I finished it today.
Oh, wow.
I just wanted to read a bit more about it. And I came across the Wikipedia page about the good-evil problem. And the philosophers that tries to have really interesting.
Okay, amazing.
And then it followed on to like a right body perception. So I understand. Just ask.
Right. Okay, so that's a good follow-up for... Okay, fine. Okay, so remind me... I think, we're here next week. Okay, so remind me if I haven't... we should talk about that too.
Because the different philosophers that were deists, and the idea of... I came across Leibnizian optimism.
Yeah.
So the best... We live in the best.
Best of all parts of the world, yeah. Yeah.
And how it's almost maybe a farce to think so optimistically about it.
Yes.
And how these deists kind of grappling with the idea of the good and evil problem.
Yeah.
There was this terrible flood or earthquake in Lisbon in the 18th century, and there was so much devastation.
Yeah.
And a lot of the optimists that were following Leibnizian really struggled to
Yes.
kind of comprehend
Yes.
the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was like half an hour before it.
Fantastic. Oh, perfect time. Very good.
So thank you so much.
Pleasure.